Michael O'Brien had spent most of his life serving his country. As a decorated veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, he had seen the best and worst of humanity in distant battlefields. But now, in his later years, all he wanted was peace, a life spent tending to the land his family had owned for generations. His farm, nestled in the rolling fields of Ontario, was more than just soil and crops. It was history, it was legacy, it was home. Alongside his wife, Margaret, Michael had dedicated himself to the quiet rhythms of farm life. Early mornings, hard work, and the satisfaction of watching the land flourish under his care. He took pride in the knowledge that his ancestors had walked these same fields, built this same barn, and harvested from this same land. But despite his deep connection to the farm, he knew that the world was changing. Greedy developers were circling, and even his own relatives had begun whispering about selling. To them, it was just a plot of land, a business opportunity. To Michael, it was everything, and he wasn't about to give it up without a fight. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter, cold, impersonal, and laced with legal jargon. It was from a real estate firm representing a major development company, offering a generous sum for the O'Brien farm. Michael barely glanced at the number before tossing the letter aside. He had no interest in selling. But when the second letter arrived, followed by a third, each with an increasingly aggressive tone, he knew this wasn't going to be just another routine land deal. The real betrayal, however, came from within his own family. His cousins, distant relatives who had never worked the land, never felt the sting of a hard day's labor in the fields, had teamed up with the developers. To them, selling was the logical choice, an easy way to cash out of a legacy they had no personal connection to. They accused Michael of being stubborn, of clinging to the past at the cost of a lucrative future. Then came the threats, lawsuits, claims that the farm should be divided and sold, that Michael had no right to refuse a deal that would make everyone rich. Margaret tried to reason with them, but it was no use. The developers had promised fortunes, and greed had already taken root. Standing on his porch, staring out at the land his father and grandfather had poured their sweat into, Michael clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a farm. This was his life, his duty, and if they thought he would surrender without a fight, they didn't know Michael O'Brien. It started with a simple chore, a routine check of the old barn after a heavy storm. The roof had been leaking, and Michael suspected that some of the wooden beams might need reinforcing. As he stepped inside, the scent of damp hay and aged timber filled the air. Margaret was by his side, holding a flashlight, her expression weary but determined. They had spent years keeping this farm standing. Letting it fall apart now, especially under the weight of legal battles, was not an option. Michael's boots scuffed against something solid beneath the dirt floor. At first, he thought it was just a rock, but when he crouched down and brushed away the loose soil, he saw metal, something flat and cold, buried beneath years of dust and neglect. He exchanged a glance with Margaret, who knelt beside him. Michael's boots scuffed against something solid beneath the dirt floor. At first, he thought it was just a rock, but when he crouched down and brushed away the loose soil, he saw metal, something flat and cold, buried beneath years of dust and neglect. He exchanged a glance with Margaret, who knelt beside him, shining the flashlight over the surface. A handle, a steel hatch, bolted shut. His heart pounded. This barn had been in his family for generations. He had spent his childhood playing in it, had repaired its walls with his father, had stored his tools in the very spot where he now knelt. And yet, he had never seen this before. With a deep breath, he grasped the handle and pulled. The metal groaned in protest, refusing to budge. Margaret placed a steadying hand on his arm. "Michael, what is this?" He didn't have an answer. But one thing was certain. This farm held more secrets than he had ever imagined. And whatever was hidden beneath them had been buried for a reason. The hatch finally gave way with a deep, metallic groan, releasing a rush of cold, stale air from the darkness below. Michael and Margaret exchanged a tense glance before he aimed his flashlight down the narrow shaft. A steel staircase, rusted but sturdy, spiraled into the unknown. His pulse quickened. Whatever lay beneath this farm had been sealed away for decades, untouched, unseen. Slowly, he descended, the echoes of his footsteps bouncing off the walls. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of damp concrete, and something else, something mechanical. At the bottom, He found himself in a long corridor lined with faded military insignias. Thick steel doors, some marked with warnings in both English and French, stretched out before him. He traced his fingers over a rusted plaque, property of the Canadian Armed Forces, restricted access. Margaret, standing behind him, inhaled sharply. "Michael, this is a military facility." He nodded, his mind racing. Why had no one ever mentioned this? Why had his father never spoken of it? He pushed open one of the doors, revealing a room filled with outdated equipment, radios, filing cabinets, even an old map of Canada marked with strategic locations. But it was the documents stacked on a desk that sent a chill down his spine. Classified files, bearing the emblem of the Department of National Defense, detailing operations from the Cold War era. Margaret's voice was hushed but urgent. "Michael, this is history, and it's been buried right under our feet." He clenched his jaw, realization dawning. This wasn't just an abandoned bunker. This was a piece of Canada's forgotten past. And now, it was in their hands. Michael stood frozen, the weight of history pressing down on him as he scanned the documents scattered across the desk. Some were yellowed with age, others stamped with classified in bold red ink. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. References to covert military operations, intelligence exchanges, and, most unsettling of all, a series of maps that outlined strategic defense points across Canada. One location was circled in ink, O'Brien Farm, Ontario. His stomach tightened. Why was his family's land marked on a Cold War-era document? Had his father known about this? Had he been involved? Michael thought back to his childhood, to the long hours his father spent alone in the barn, to the late-night phone calls he never explained. Had his father been keeping secrets all along? Margaret placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her expression mirroring his concern. "Michael, if your father knew about this, why didn't he ever say anything?" He exhaled sharply. That was the question burning in his mind. If this facility had been part of a government operation, why had it been abandoned? And more importantly, who else knew it was here? His heart pounded as he looked around the bunker. Dust had settled thickly over most surfaces, but some areas, like the metal filing cabinet in the corner, looked as if they had been disturbed recently. Michael's instincts, honed from years of military service, screamed at him that something wasn't right. If this place had been forgotten, then why did it feel like someone had been here before them? And if someone had, were they planning to come back? It started with letters, polite at first, then increasingly aggressive. Michael's distant relatives, the ones who had never cared for the farm, were now demanding a share. They claimed their rights, insisting the land was worth a fortune and should be sold. When Michael refused, they escalated. One morning, he found tire tracks cutting deep into the soil near his barn, the unmistakable signs of someone having trespassed overnight. A week later, Margaret discovered the fence along the southern field had been deliberately cut, allowing livestock to wander. It was no accident. It was a warning. Then came the legal notice, a lawsuit filed against him, challenging his sole ownership of the land. They were working with a high-powered real estate lawyer, a man known for crushing opposition. The document was clear. They intended to force the sale, claiming that as blood relatives, they had a right to a stake in the property. Michael read the papers in silence, his jaw clenched. He had spent years tending to this land, sweating through long summers, repairing every broken fence post, weathering every harsh winter. His father had entrusted it to him, not to a pack of opportunists who had never lifted a hand to maintain it. Margaret placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "They don't know who they're dealing with," she said. Michael exhaled slowly, nodding. They wanted to fight? Then they would get one. Michael knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. His enemies weren't just greedy relatives anymore. They were powerful investors with deep pockets and hidden agendas. He needed allies, people who understood the stakes, people he could trust. And there was only one person who came to mind, Colonel Richard Dawson. That evening, Michael sat in his study, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating the faded military medals displayed on the shelf. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The line rang twice before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Dawson." Michael exhaled. "Rich, it's me. I need your help." There was a pause, then the sound of a chair creaking as Dawson leaned forward. "I was wondering when you'd call." Michael quickly explained the situation, the hidden military facility beneath his farm, the sudden aggression from his relatives, and the disturbing revelation that foreign investors were involved. The more he spoke, the more his old friend's tone hardened. "This isn't just about land, Michael," Dawson said. "If that facility contains classified intelligence, it could be a serious threat if it falls into the wrong hands." Michael nodded, even though Dawson couldn't see him. "I know. That's why I need to stop them before it's too late." Dawson was silent for a moment before he spoke again. "I still have contacts in Ottawa, people who care about protecting this country. I'll make some calls. In the meantime, you need to be careful. If these investors know what's buried under your farm, they won't just play fair." Michael tightened his grip on the phone. He had been prepared to fight a legal battle, but now he realized this was something far more dangerous. He wasn't just defending his home. He was stepping into a conflict that could have national consequences. But no matter how high the stakes were, he wasn't going to back down. A week later, Dawson called back, his voice edged with urgency. "Michael, you were right to be concerned. I pulled some strings, and what I found, it's bigger than either of us thought." Michael's grip on the phone tightened. He stood near the barn, the vast fields stretching beyond him. But suddenly, his land felt much smaller, like a battlefield closing in. "Tell me," he said. Dawson exhaled heavily. "The facility under your farm wasn't just some forgotten Cold War bunker. It was a covert research site, one of the most classified projects in Canadian military history. Intelligence operations, experimental technology, records of strategic alliances, it's all there, buried beneath your feet." Michael felt the weight of those words settle on his chest. He had spent his life believing the land was simply a family inheritance, passed down through generations. But now, he understood why his father had always been so protective of it, why he had never spoken of its deeper significance. "There's more," Dawson continued. "The people trying to take your land, they aren't just greedy developers. They're connected to foreign interests, and they know exactly what's down there. If they gained control of that site, they could access information that was meant to stay buried." Michael's mind raced. This wasn't just about property anymore. It wasn't even just about his family's legacy. It was about national security. His enemies weren't just looking to profit from land sales. They were after something far more dangerous. A cold wind rustled through the trees, and Michael clenched his jaw. He had fought for his country once before, on distant battlefields. Now, the fight had come to his doorstep. "I'm not letting them take it," he said, his voice firm. "Not now? Not ever." Dawson's response was just as resolute. "Then you better be ready for what comes next." The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse in Toronto was packed. Journalists, veterans, historians, people who had heard whispers of the controversy surrounding the O'Brien farm had come to witness the battle unfold. Michael sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly as his lawyer, Daniel Mercer, prepared for the fight ahead. Across the room, his relatives sat with their high-powered attorneys, smug in their belief that money and influence would guarantee their victory. But Michael had something more powerful: the truth. As the proceedings began, the opposing lawyers painted Michael as an old farmer clinging to the past, unwilling to let progress take its course. They spoke of the great economic opportunity the development would bring, citing job creation and modern housing. But when it was Mercer's turn, he wasted no time dismantling their argument. He presented the classified documents Dawson had uncovered, detailing the site's true history. With each revelation, gasps echoed through the courtroom. The O'Brien farm was not just a farm. It was a hidden chapter of Canada's military past. The evidence made it clear, if the land was sold, sensitive national intelligence could fall into the wrong hands. Then came the final blow. Mercer exposed the secret dealings between Michael's relatives and foreign investors. Emails, financial records, and recorded conversations painted a damning picture. They had not only planned to sell the land, but had intended to do so at the expense of Canada's security. The judge leaned forward, her expression grave. "The evidence presented here today is undeniable," she said, her voice firm. "This land is not just a property dispute. It is a matter of national heritage and security." After hours of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. The court ruled in Michael's favor. The farm was to be protected as a historic site, permanently safeguarding it from corporate or foreign takeover. His relatives were found guilty of fraudulent dealings, their scheme exposed for all to see. As the gavel struck, finalizing the decision, Michael exhaled, the weight of months of battle lifting from his shoulders. He turned to Margaret, who squeezed his hand tightly. They had won, not just for themselves, but for the future of their land, their family, and their country. Months had passed since the trial, but for Michael O'Brien, the fight had only just begun. Winning the legal battle had secured the land, but now came the greater challenge, honoring what it truly stood for. The farm, once a quiet piece of family heritage, had now become a recognized historic site, a place where Canada's forgotten military past had been brought to light. But Michael knew it could be more than that. Standing on his porch one crisp autumn morning, he watched as a group of young cadets arrived for a tour. Veterans, historians, and local officials had already taken an interest in the site, but Michael saw an opportunity to do something bigger, something that would serve not just history, but the people who had fought for it. With Margaret by his side, he began working on a plan to transform the farm into a dedicated center for veterans, a place where those who had served could heal, reconnect, and find purpose after returning home. In the fields where his ancestors had once toiled, there would now be programs for mental and physical rehabilitation. The underground facility, once hidden from the world, would be preserved as a museum, ensuring that future generations would never forget the sacrifices made. The land would no longer just be about crops or court battles. It would stand as a living tribute to resilience, duty, and national pride. As he watched the cadets walk toward the bunker entrance, Michael took a deep breath. The farm had been saved, but his mission had only just begun. The transformation of the O'Brien farm into a sanctuary for veterans was more than just a project. It was a calling. Michael poured his heart into every detail, ensuring that the land would not only preserve history, but also provide a future for those who had sacrificed so much. With the support of local officials and veteran organizations, he oversaw the development of facilities tailored to help former soldiers rebuild their lives. What was once farmland now held training grounds for physical rehabilitation, counseling centers for mental health support, and quiet spaces where veterans could reconnect with themselves and each other. The underground bunker, once a relic of secrecy, had been restored into a museum and education center, offering guided tours and workshops on Canada's military history. For the first time, the truth buried beneath the soil was being shared with the world. As word spread, veterans from across the country arrived, some hesitant, others desperate for a place to belong. Michael saw himself in many of them, men and women who had given everything in service, only to return home feeling lost. But here, on this land, they found purpose again. They worked side by side, mentoring younger recruits, tending to the grounds, and sharing stories that had long been locked away. It wasn't just a farm anymore. It was a refuge, a place of healing. One evening, as Michael walked the property, he spotted a group of veterans gathered near the bunker entrance. They were laughing, the weight on their shoulders just a little lighter. He felt a deep sense of peace. This was what his fight had been for. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the rolling fields of the O'Brien farm, Michael stood on the front porch, gazing out at the land he had fought so hard to protect. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint sounds of laughter and conversation from the veterans gathered near the training grounds. It was a sound that had once been absent from this place, proof that the farm had become more than just a piece of land. It was now a symbol of resilience, of second chances, of honor restored. Margaret stepped beside him, slipping her hand into his. They stood in silence, taking in the sight of the land that had once been on the verge of being stolen away. The same soil where generations of O'Briens had toiled was now a sanctuary, not just for their family's legacy, but for those who had served their country. Michael's gaze drifted to the old bunker, its steel entrance now adorned with a plaque bearing his father's name. The truth that had once been buried in secrecy was now etched into history for all to see. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past settle in his chest, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. He had done what his father would have wanted. He had preserved something far greater than just land. As he turned to head inside, he looked up at the vast Canadian sky, painted in shades of deep orange and violet. The fight was over, but his mission would continue. This was no longer just a farm. It was a legacy, a promise that the sacrifices of the past would never be forgotten. And for the first time in years, Michael felt at peace, knowing that he had fulfilled his father's unspoken wish. The story of Michael O'Brien is more than just a tale of one man's fight to protect his family's land. It is a testament to the power of resilience, integrity, and the importance of preserving history. In today's world, where traditions are often overshadowed by corporate greed and personal ambition, Michael's journey reminds us that some things are worth fighting for. His battle was not just about a farm. It was about the values that land represented: honor, sacrifice, and the unwavering commitment to something greater than oneself. For many, his struggle resonates on a deeply personal level. Whether it's a family business threatened by large corporations, a community at risk of losing its cultural heritage, or individuals standing up against injustice, the core message remains the same. The past matters, and so do the people who dedicate their lives to protecting it. Michael's determination shows us that even when the odds seem insurmountable, standing firm in one's beliefs can create lasting change. His victory was not just a personal one. It was a triumph for all who believe that history should be honored, that service should be remembered, and that legacies should be preserved. His story challenges us to reflect on our own values and the battles we choose to fight. Are we willing to stand up for what truly matters? Are we willing to protect the things that define us? In the end, Michael's story is a call to action, a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it.